Welcome, everyone. Got a big crowd today, which we're excited to see. Thank you for joining us. And I think we're going to go ahead and get started with I believe it's our 60th episode of This is CDR. This is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals OpenAir is seeking to advance here in the United States, basically at every level of government, local, state, and national, federal, as well as in national and subnational jurisdictions globally. My name is Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York. Work on policy advocacy for carbon removal with OpenAir. If you've not done so, please introduce yourself in the chat. Also, make sure you're directing your introduction to everyone and not just to the panelists. Would love to hear who you are, where you're coming from, and where you're zooming in from. Just some quick background on OpenAir. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to advancing carbon removal. We are a global community. We work together on what we call missions, which are shared open source projects and really 4 different areas: research and development, messaging and communications, policy advocacy, and activist market development. Our co-founder, Chris Neidl, is running the chat, and he's been putting some links in there. I think he'll put a link in there to a form where you can that you can fill out to hop onto our Discord server, which is how we organize our projects. We'd love to have you. There's plenty to do, and I would also add that it's a lot of fun. Before we get started today, as we do with all This is CDR episodes, want to put a definition of carbon removal up on the screen. This is from a great resource called the CDR Primer, which is an online document. You can also get a physical hard copy that is put together by 50 plus CDR experts, researchers, academics, and it's a great overview of what carbon removal is. This definition is pulled from that document. It's also essentially the same definition that the IPCC uses, so it's one that we like. Carbon removal is a purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably put it away in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. 2 really important things to call out when you talk about CDR. Number 1, carbon removal is distinct from what is commonly called carbon capture in the media and elsewhere. Carbon capture typically refers to point source carbon capture, which means capturing CO2 from an emission source, whether it's a natural gas power plant or a cement plant. Carbon capture may or may not be a good climate solution, depending on the specific socio-economic, techno-economic context. But one thing it's very clearly not is carbon removal. Carbon capture is a form of emissions reduction. Carbon removal is removing CO2 from the atmosphere. 2 different things. Number 2, whenever we talk about carbon removal, it's essential to keep in mind, call out, remember forever that carbon removal is in no way, shape, or form a substitute for reducing emissions. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions globally and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there's clear scientific consensus that carbon removal will be required if we want to have any chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is, number 1, there are going to be some emission sources that are going to be hard to decarbonize and eliminate completely in a climate relevant timeframe. I think the best example of these are emissions from our agriculture and food systems. People need to eat. They are a third of global emissions. We're not going to be able to zero them out by 2050. So we're going to need carbon removal to be able to hit net zero by 2050. Number 2, we already have 1 trillion plus tons of anthropogenic CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're already seeing catastrophic effects from warming. So we're also in the second half of the century going to need to be removing CO2 from the atmosphere to restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. So for those reasons, carbon removal is an essential climate solution. It is not a replacement for reducing emissions. It's a complement along with adapting to our already changed climate. So it's really important. Our current scale of carbon removal is tens of thousands of tons per year. So that's a long way from billions of tons. So we have a lot of work to do to get started on scaling carbon removal now, which is one of the main reasons we're here. I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Megha, who is going to talk a bit about run of show and then introduce today's speaker.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha. I'm an OpenAir member based in London, and I work on policy advocacy as well. So just as usual, we're going to start with a short presentation followed by a few prepared questions and then moderated audience Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout, please type them in the Q&A box in Zoom. Just note that that's separate from the chat box. So try to find the Q&A one to help us organize it a little bit more easily. The event's being recorded, so we'll send the video link out to all of you who registered, and we will also post it to OpenAir's website and to our YouTube channel. This week, we're very excited to welcome CarbonCapture CEO Adrian Corless, who will help update us on Project Bison, which is the company's ambitious 5 megaton planned deployment in Wyoming, and discuss the company's plans to scale beyond that in the US and globally. Adrian has spent more than 25 years developing and commercializing products in the cleantech industry. From 2013 to 2018, he was the CEO of Carbon Engineering, where he successfully developed the company into a recognized global leader in CO2 direct air capture, piloting industrial scale systems in under 2 years. In addition, Adrian has spent over 15 years commercializing industrial hydrogen, fuel cell, and pump technologies, serving as CEO of Rotoliptic Technologies, CTO of Plug Power, and CTO of Cellex Power Products. He holds a Master's of Science degree from the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, with a specialization in energy systems, cryogenics, and LNG. So, Adrian, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Des. Let me start by just sharing the screen. Good. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate the introduction, and I think this is one time we're going to have to start by disagreeing that actually, CarbonCapture, the company, actually is carbon removal, and I think we can thank Bill Gross for the name, but to not confuse anybody, CarbonCapture Inc. is a company that's focused on direct air capture. So the mission, not surprisingly, is simply around decarbonizing the atmosphere. So we are a pure play on carbon removal, and our approach is really around the development and deployment of direct air capture machines, specifically focused on the concepts of modularity, which allows us to think about how we deploy incrementally over time, and also this idea of upgradability. And I'll talk a fair bit about this idea of our open systems architecture and how we're engaging the technical community, particularly around sorbent technology. So just a little bit about the background of the company and the backstory. The company actually was founded almost exactly 4 years ago. And so at Davos 2019, Bill Gross was there. He was there with Mark Benioff of Salesforce. They were having a discussion really around where is the focus, or where should the focus be in terms of solving the world's largest climate problems. That was a debate between should be a focus on the ocean or a focus on the atmosphere. Bill won that argument, and it was the two of them agreed it was really the atmosphere, and they actually went and both put some initial angel capital in to get the company started. And kind of as Bill does, out of Idea Lab, he put a small team together. As technology was evolving, he was able to put a reasonable amount of seed capital in to let the company explore and grow on the technical side. And when it really became apparent that from a technical point of view and really the markets were evolving towards recognizing again the need for carbon removal and DAC in particular, he reached out to me, and given my background with carbon engineering, asked if I would come down to California and take over from him and run the company, which I said yes. It was a great opportunity for me. I was really pleased to get back into direct air capture, especially with the way things are evolving in the space. We were able to immediately go and raise capital into the company, and that's kind of one of the things that's also changed in the last 5 years. Is capital or access to capital for direct air capture. It's actually a thing now. So since really the end of 2021 and through 2022, it's been a really fun ride. And so 2022, lots happened, including the IRA passing with its focus on direct air capture. We were really focusing internally on getting tech ready at a commercial scale. So by August of last year, we had our first commercial scale reactor up and running. We moved into a new facility in downtown Los Angeles, in the Arts District, which is where we are now. So we have a space that allows us to be together as a team and to be developing large pieces of equipment. And then based on the progress we've made technically, and what was happening, in terms of support, specifically the IRA, we announced Project Bison. I'll talk more about that, but really it was really us, basically making a very large statement around our ambitions to grow a big company quickly. And so 2023, it's really all about execution. By the end of this year, we'll have our first hardware out in the field in Wyoming, and the plan is to also have stood up our first manufacturing facility for our equipment. So in terms of building a large direct air capture company, it all comes down to focusing on cost reduction. So really that's everything that we're doing, all of our strategy, both technically and on the commercial side, is focused on cost reduction. I would say primarily, and at the core, and is really around materials and materials innovation. So, again, as we start to talk about what is driving the main elements of cost, whether it be CapEx or OpEx and energy, it all generally stems out of the choices that you're making at the materials that are within the product. The second for us is this focus on modularity and this ability to make lots of the same thing and factory build hardware as opposed to stick building large chem-eng like plants. And so this modularity allows us to go take incremental steps in deployment. It allows us to introduce technology and innovation as we build out projects. And I think, it's this whole idea of just having your development cycles and your innovation cycles be in the matter of years rather than decades when we're talking about very large static pieces of technology. And then the last for us has been, to focus on projects that are inherently scalable. And so we've been really careful not to be developing a series of progressively larger demonstrations that ultimately will get stranded. And so right from the beginning, we'll talk about Project Bison. That's a project that has the geology, it has the land, it has the support for it to become a megaton scale project, but we can start with thousands of tons this year and next year. And so that scalability and that ability to focus more on execution than chasing projects is another one of the cores to cost reduction. So just quick technical sort of background on how we're approaching the problem. So, we're taking a material science approach. We're using a temperature vacuum swing adsorption process. So at the core of our product is sorbents that will have the characteristics of having a high affinity for CO2. So we were able to pass air over a structured sorbent to pull out about 3/4 of the CO2 in a single pass. It takes about 30 minutes for us to fully load that sorbent, at which point we'll take that particular reactor offline, we'll pull the dead air out, and then we'll heat those sorbents, in the case of our launch products, to around 80 Celsius to liberate the CO2. And at that point, we can pull that CO2 off in a pure form as our product. Finally, we'll cool that sorbent back down and put it back into service. So if you can imagine that we have in a module, in our case, 16 reactors sort of acting asynchronously, it allows us to do this continuous capture and delivery of CO2. So again, core to this is the sorbent that we're using. And the approach we're taking is really to build an architecture and define a set of interfaces that allow us to think about the use of a variety of different sorbents in the same machine. So that's really key. And it's really key in part because when I think back like 5 years, in the context of direct air capture, there was probably no unique research or R&D happening on DAC sorbents. And really what the industry had, and what this industry still really has today, is some commercially available sorbents that were developed for other purposes. But we're seeing now this proliferation of R&D that's happening at universities, at national labs, and within corporate R&D labs, specific to direct air capture. That's just what we're seeing now, and what we're testing in our labs is seeing just a rapid improvement in what's available to put into direct air capture machines. And I think when we think forward to gigaton scale removal, most certainly those materials that'll get us to the performance and cost where we need to be, that 100-ton level category, certainly haven't been invented yet. So just a little bit more on this idea of an open systems architecture. And so I think for us, it's a decision that we made pretty early on, and it was based on this premise again too, that there's just certainly going to be an evolution on material science, which is not going to stop. And I think locking technology in too early is going to be problematic and certainly limiting in our ability to be able to drive cost over time in the system. So we've got an approach where right now we have about a dozen unique relationships that are either focused on the sorbents, and some of those are coming out of universities, some of them are coming out of corporate labs, or on the structuring of sorbents. And structuring can be simply structuring into a form that has low pressure drop, that defines certain interfaces, but structuring also is, I would say, adding certain performance characteristics or abilities to sorbents, in terms of solubility or managing high temperature oxidation and things like that. So the structuring itself is also part of the performance of the package. So we've focused on that, that particular strategy. It's kind of key to our cost reduction strategy. It also allows us to think about, as we think about Wyoming versus the Gulf Coast, the ability to tailor sorbents or to make decisions based on climate as well. So the combination of temperature and humidity tend to have a strong influence on performance of sorbents. Beyond that, this is really where our machine comes in. And so, we have an approach where by defining a common set of interfaces at the cartridge level, our reactors can then take the materials that we're launching with this year, but also they're compatible with materials that we'll be deploying in the years to come as advancements progress. The reactor itself is kind of that is the point at which I think the science of the engineering is largely demonstrated. And so within the context of direct air capture, that's what we build lots of. And if we were a solar company, that would be the equivalent to the solar panel. We assemble 16 of those reactors into a module, which is in the form factor of a 40-foot shipping container. And in the field, we're defining, I would say, a logical number of modules that we will call a cluster that share common services. And that really defines the repeating unit that allows us to build very large projects in the context of arrays. So this is, again, just that modularity shown at a number of different levels of the organization. A little bit about, where we innovate. And I think, there's, some misconceptions that because we're working with so many third parties on materials development that we don't actually develop IP, and that's actually not quite the case. So in the context of sorbent discovery, a lot of the work we're doing, the sponsored research we're doing at different universities is really, that's again, just an extension of our team, and certainly the access we have to what's developed of those programs is ours uniquely. Second is that in how we structure sorbents in the context of managing performance, pressure drop, et cetera, there's a lot that's going on there that is sort of a rich ground for intellectual property as well. And then everything else, around the machine, obviously there's lots of opportunity for innovation and intellectual property. And finally, just how we control the machine, how we think about its operation and management of the machines in a system or in a system of modules, and also climate impacts and those sorts of things. There's a lot that's going on at the control side. So that's kind of I'll just pause there. That's, kind of a description of what we're doing from a technology point of view, and how we're approaching materials, et cetera, and how we're thinking about cost reduction. Next couple slides are just, probably familiar for everybody that's on this call, but it's the first slide is just really this idea of where does DAC play in the goal of net zero by 2050. And I think, we've never really had a challenge as an industry describing the need at 2050 for gigaton levels of removal. And I think that by definition, that implies, a very large industry that's going to come out of effectively what's nascent today into something that needs to necessarily be an industry roughly as large as today's oil and gas industry. So there's a really big growth that needs to happen, but it's never really been evident, I would say, up until last year about, what gets the industry started towards this really big, audacious goal of being $1 trillion market. And I think what's interesting is that, 2022, a couple things happened, I think, that are really impactful. First is it was, and actually not just 2022, but starting in 2021, the signaling of industry, or signaling particularly of a lot of the tech companies and other very profitable companies, that they were going to step in and start to buy credits at a premium, an engineered carbon removal credits to actually get the industry going. And I think that as 2022 progressed, 2022 was probably a year where we saw almost $2 billion of new commitments for engineered carbon removals. And so that signal was really key. And it happened at the same time that in the US particularly, there was policies emerging that were really favorable for carbon removal. And, late 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law set aside the $3.5 billion for DAC hubs. That FOA is on the street now. We're actively working with a lot of the different industry partners on how that's going to play out. But probably even more important, for us was the revisions to the 45Q IRA policies under the Inflation Reduction Act. And so that movement to $180 a ton for direct air capture plus sequestration, alongside clarity on how long that was going to be available. So, that clarity that subsidies are going to be available for equipment deployed up to 2032 plus another 12 years gives us really strong market signal that DAC is actually ready to scale. And so for us, we have, especially now with the IRA and with the signaling from the partners on the offtake side, we have really ambitious plans to grow the company over the next decade. And so, we're thinking again that we're, by the end of the 2030s to be somewhere in a range of 10 megatons of installed capacity. And the way we're doing that, as I said earlier, is to really focus on a few large projects. And so the first we announced back in September was Project Bison. And so Project Bison is a 5 megaton project. It's in the southwest corner of Wyoming in Sweetwater County. It's basically looks to be and is on schedule to be the first DAC project that will be integrated with a Class 6 injection well for CO2 storage. And so I think a few just technical details around that. We will be delivering the first couple of modules into the project late this year. The structure of that is the whole project is pretty simple. It is a carbon removal as a service business. So we will be generating and then selling the carbon removal credits into the voluntary market today, and then also generating the 45Q subsidy credits as well. So that's basically the business. We've partnered with Frontier Carbon Solutions. So they're a company that's focused on carbon removal as a business in terms of sequestration and the development of Class 6 wells. So they're the partner on the storage side. And Fluor is our EPC. We're working with them just right now, boots on the ground in the early stages of development of the project. And again, as I mentioned, this is in the southwest corner of Wyoming. So the way we're approaching Project Bison, again, is we're taking advantage of the modularity of the way we're building out our system. So phase one, which is 2023 and 2024, is pretty modest. We're targeting to get about 20 of our modules on the ground, which represents about 10,000 tons of capacity per year. And the reason we're doing that, again, that first year is really all about de-risking technology, and also being able to validate that we can monetize both the voluntary credits and the 45Q credits. So it's really about technical and business de-risking. And then beyond that, it's really a scale up, which is going to look fairly traditional in the context of project development. So it's going to be a combination of equity being brought into the project alongside debt. But the goal through phase 2 in 25 and 26 is to expand Project Bison to 200,000 tons per year, to get to in the third phase to 1 million tons of capacity by 2028, and then to continue to scale that up to a goal of 5 megatons by 2030. So that is sort of the ramp up phases of Project Bison. So just a little bit more about Wyoming and again, I would say the way we're approaching the project from a community point of view too. And so we've put a lot of effort in community engagement and engaging at the state level. Again, the three pillars that we are focused on are really around transparency. And again, I think, in general, that's important. I'll maybe talk more about that in a bit. Next is this dependability, this idea of being a valued member of the community from a jobs creation point of view, and ultimately respecting Wyoming's natural beauty. Like, Wyoming is an incredible place. And I think, again, that's first and foremost on everybody's mind, is that this needs to be consistent with the concepts of preservation. So a little bit more on Wyoming and how we're approaching it. So we've been very proactive in the community of Sweetwater. This is an example of a town hall meeting that we sponsored, where we actually sent out flyers to all 15,000 households in the county, invited to come in, meet us, ask any questions we committed to answer, and we've been, again, just continually doing these sorts of outreaches. We're working with the local colleges and universities. Obviously, at the state level, we're very active, and with the business councils as well. And so this is, again, just sort of how we've learned, the importance of that community engagement as a key part of being able to successfully deploy a project like Project Bison in Wyoming. So where to go next? So I think as a company, again, as I said earlier, our ambition is to grow a very large direct air capture company. Between now and 2032, our focus is primarily going to be in the U.S., taking advantage of the situation around I would say the environment that's been created because of the IRA and because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and also the corporate buyers that are willing to step up. When we look at 2032 and beyond, I think that's really the point at which we'll likely step back into a more traditional tech OEM role. and be less focused on project development. And I think that's a point at which too, where we'll certainly have interest in thinking about partnerships and projects that will be deployed in other regions of the world. So I think, again, I'll pause there. I think that's I think hopefully a great intro to the company, and I'm looking forward to the question side of this.
Excellent. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Adrian. And a note on our preamble, we talk about the carbon capture question, the semantical issue there every episode. So it was not particular to you, carbon capture and Milbro, so, but understood. Our first question, do you mind unsharing your screen? So we always start out by asking presenters a little bit about their personal journey to climate and carbon removal. You're unique in our 60 presenters, except for perhaps another former CEO of carbon engineering, Steve Oldham, in terms of your vast experience, both as an engineer and executive. So I'm just going to ask you a little bit more of a specific question. You were CEO of carbon engineering for 4.5 years, and in its kind of formative period. Can you talk about maybe 2 or 3 things, or 1 or 2 things that you learned in that role that have really served you well so far as you have come on board and taken carbon capture forward?
Yeah, I think so. I think the first one I would say, and this is really about transparency, and it's really how you engage the technical community. Direct air capture is, it has its fair share of skeptics, and I think when you look back, 10 plus years, to the earlier days of direct air capture, that I think there were some of the pioneers that I think, by the way they approached the problem, the way they described the problem, they really did a lot of harm. And I think this idea that, it isn't a challenging problem, and that, I think is something that caused a lot of backlash. So I think this transparency about how the technology works, what are the issues around energy usage and land usage and water usage. I think if you're not going to be open about that, I think, you're just going to invite skepticism and criticism. So I think that's the first thing I learned there. And I think that was sort of informing why, for example, we put out the Joule paper, which was, again, just opening up the books in terms of what the technology was and what's the energy usage was, et cetera. I think the second is the importance of narrative. And I think, direct air capture and carbon removal in general, going back, I would say 10 years ago, it was more us being a bit evangelistic about trying to get a bigger percentage of the general public to understand what it was and why it was important. And I think, that's obviously, a lot has changed, but I think, that was certainly important, that having that narrative and just slowly drawing support towards the industry was key. And I think the last is, this is just more of a personal thing. And this is, again, maybe lessons learned. And if there's some young CEOs out there or wannabe CEOs, I would say that it's the importance of, the CEO's relationship with the investors and the board. And I think that, that those relationships need to be working well for the company to be working well. And I think those are 3 things. I think, that was my very first CEO role. And I would say that, that was the one I took into the subsequent roles that helped me the most.
That's great. Very good advice as well. And, in this new role, is there anything, what have you learned? Like, what is a big new thing that you've learned so far that distinct from the time your tenure at Carbon Engineering?
Yeah, I think probably the most impactful is the value of this idea and this concept of modularity, and this ability to tackle a problem a piece at a time. I know that, with carbon engineering, the challenge of building $1 billion plant as your first of a kind, that's a big bite. And that's tough to find the partners that are willing to take that risk alongside you. So for us, the modularity, the ability to go and take, a bite-sized step, to go think about Project Bison, the phase 1 being 10,000 tons, that's something that we can fund off balance sheet. That's something that we can actually own and de-risk. So I think that I think is, is probably this idea of also being able to go and iterate technology and have those technology cycles be in the matters of, months to years as opposed to decades is another critical thing. It allows you to kind of avoid technology lock-in, which I think is problematic in a nascent industry. You just can't allow yourself to be, forced into one particular technical solution when the industry is moving so quickly. I think the next thing is really the importance of partnerships. And when we think about DAC, and the deployment of DAC, I mean, it's a complex endeavor. And I've got a really, one of my board members is, he gave me some really good advice, which is like, what you really want to do is find good partners and then figure out how they're going to make a lot of money from you. And they said, then when things get tough, they'll be there to help you get through those tough times. And so you would think about the partnerships for us. We do a lot of technology partnering on the material side and the structuring side, of course. In the context of Project Bison, that only happened because we were, again, able to find the right relationship and structure a deal with Frontier that allowed us, again, to, when we think about a Class 6 well with 500,000 tons per year capacity, we're starting at 10,000 tons capacity. A lot of alignment had to happen for us to be able to go take our vision of modularity and fit it into something which is pretty capital intensive and pretty chunky in terms of deployment. So those partnerships were really important. The other one that's coming up is, and I'm sure we'll want to talk about this a little more, is the partnerships on the energy side. And so every direct air capture project is by definition a very large energy project as well. And so same issue in terms of developing energy projects incrementally. It's not how it's normally done. And so you need to really develop the right kind of relationships and partnerships that work for the partners. And then, obviously the last is this, the partnerships on the offtake side as well too. And so we're spending a lot of time, in around the various different buyers right now. There's a lot of obvious ones, or whether it's the Frontier Fund or whether it's Microsoft or others that are there, but there is a growing number of other channels to market as well too that we're engaging in. So those partnerships that are going to allow us to keep up in terms of the demand side as we're focused on executing and deploying hardware is going to be key, because otherwise it's not a business. So maybe I'll just pause there. So I think those are a couple of things that are key.
I mean, fantastic answers. Just on the modularity point, we had put this in the chat, but there's a great exploration of modularity from Naeem Merchant and on his excellent Carbon Curve blog, and Chris just put that link in the chat. And we'll also find a link. Adrian was on. I listened to a couple weeks ago a great episode of Naeem's podcast with you. So really good points raised there. And there's also an article that I'll find in a bit by Peter Miner at Carbon 180 on DAC 2.0 that it really has some interesting exploration of modularity as well. On the partnership side, can you very quickly disambiguate the two frontiers we mentioned just for the audience?
Right.
The Frontier,
the
CDR procurers, and then we have Frontier, which is your sequestration partner in Wyoming.
Yeah, that's right. So Frontier Carbon Solutions is a company focused on carbon removal as a service based. Their first project is in Sweetwater County in Wyoming. So they are a company that is doing the geology and then the drilling and completion and operation of Class 6 wells. So that's Frontier Carbon Solutions. The Frontier Fund is the and I'll probably get the number right wrong, but $960 million or so aggregate fund from Meta and Google or Alphabet and McKinsey and others that basically is generally run through Stripe, which is the group that's actually going out and doing the offtake agreements with various carbon removal companies like ourselves. So those are the two frontiers.
I think probably 60% of the audience was clear on that, but in case anyone was not, point. And I put the Frontier Climate link in the chat, and here's the Frontier Carbon Solutions link if anyone's interested. So you've referenced these already, but there are a few large elephants in the room, as it were. When we talk about direct air capture, we'd love to get your thoughts on them. First, as you mentioned, energy requirements. Number one, can you just recap the per ton energy requirements for your systems, and maybe for the DAC geeks in the audience, break it down into capture or air contact and regeneration?
Sure. And so what I'll do is I'll give you kind of a map, because obviously, what we see through the work we're doing on the materials science and the work we're doing, within the engineering of the product, we have a roadmap to reduce that over time. But we're starting out, and the other thing I'll say is that, breaking it down into thermal and electricity is probably a good proxy for breaking it down into, the regeneration on the thermal side versus the electricity on the capture side, more or less. And so when we look at the Gen 1 systems that we'll be deploying later this year, we're looking at somewhere around 7 to 8 gigajoules per ton of thermal and around 2 gigajoules per ton of electrical needs for the system. When we look at, getting to the material, so we have what we call a Gen 3 material we're testing in our labs right now. It has about 3 times the capacity of the commercially available sorbents. And so this ability to drive more CO2 per cycle is really important. So if we think about, if we're targeting 500 tons per year per module in our Gen 1 product, we'll be well over 1,000 tons per module in our Gen 3. The thermal cycling, and I would say that, the carrying of parasitic mass in a thermal cycle, if you can get 3 times the amount of CO2 per cycle, it has a dramatic impact on the overall energy requirement. So we see ourselves getting at that point somewhere to 3 to 4 gigajoules per ton on the thermal, and still around 2 gigajoules on the electrical side. We have some interesting programs, and we're doing this with a couple different universities where most of what we're using, in fact, all of the sorbents we're looking at for Gen 1 through Gen 3 are amine based. So they all are, a chemisorbent, and that has basically an inherent minimum energy for desorption that you can't do much to get around. And when we look at, Gen 4, things we want to be deploying roughly 8 to 10 years from now, we have a strong focus on getting back to physisorbents. So it's primarily MOF. And so when we can get looking at physisorbents and reducing this, now we're starting, what gets important is the actual, theoretical minimum desorption energy. There's definitely a pathway to get to somewhere around 2 gigajoules of thermal and roughly 2 gigajoules of electricity.
Got it. And if you're like me and you don't know much about this stuff, I just put a converter from gigajoule to megawatt hour in the chat. Is it correct that it's like 4 gigajoules to 1 megawatt hour? Is that rough?
Sounds like you have the converter. That one I don't have top of mind.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So that was really great, and thank you for also breaking it down into how you sort of foresee the improvement over time. Can you talk about how this maybe go to your nth of a kind? How does this translate into land use? Or like a megaton, like how big is the plant, and then how big roughly? Obviously, it depends on what the generation is, but how big roughly is the land use for the generation needed for the plant?
Yeah, so roughly it's about 10 to 1. First of all, like that ratio, the actual, if we're thinking, and I'll stick to specifically talking about solar, but in terms of having sufficient solar, to have the overcapacity to mate with storage, you need, in the context of, what we're thinking for Project Bison, which is, 5 million tons. So maybe reduce it out. So it turns out that, we would need about 100 acres of land for the direct air capture systems, but you would need roughly 1,000 acres to support the, what's all getting pretty close to a gigawatt of solar or renewables that are required to run that project. So, again, it would be a large project.
And okay, so is this for 1 megaton or for 5 megatons?
That's for 5 megatons. So 5.
Okay, so let me recap. 5 megatons is 100 acres for the plant and 1,000 acres for the solar.
Yeah, and being in Wyoming, the reality is that probably a fair amount of that will be wind, which is significantly lower land footprint.
Okay, and I just that on the one hand is a lot of land. Like I don't have 1,000 acres, but on the other hand, I would just point out that Wyoming has 62.5 million acres in the state. I think 70% of which is owned by the federal government. There are 50 kilometer square ranches. The largest ranch in the state of Wyoming is owned by the owner of the Arsenal Football Club, and it's 50 kilometers squared. So, on one hand, that's a lot of land. On the other hand, we have a lot of land. So I think, siting is really important, and the land uses and the energy requirements are large, but they're also, they're not completely unachievable, I would say, just to editorialize. Yeah. Because there's a little bit of back and forth on the land use requirements for the Project Bison, and they're large, but there's also a lot of land there. So something to work out.
Yeah, and one of the things and again, this is maybe not this is not for now or 2030, but I think that ultimately the growth of DAC, I think there's a lot of other things that I think will evolve over time that'll help. I think. Again, I'm not sure where your audience tends to sit on the growth of the nuclear industry, sort of 2.0. I think it's going to be essential. I think that even in the state of Wyoming is actually where TerraPower is deploying its first system. So there is, I think, some interesting things that could evolve in the energy systems as well too that are going to help from a land use point of view, and I think probably necessarily so.
And just to be clear, the plan, maybe not for the initial very first deployment, but the plan for Project Bison is to also deploy additional renewable generation, so you're not taking green electrons off the grid.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, I think that the concept of additionality is kind of central to the relationships we're developing with the energy developer partners. It's just a given, and I think that's a challenge again when you think about it in a project where we want to know. We're not saying let's just go and put a 500 megawatt project out and we'll give you a 20-year PPA. We're asking for something a little bit different, which is a little bit more challenging.
Yeah. Okay, we're running out of my time, but I have two more questions that I do want to get to. The other, well, there are, I guess, a couple elephants in the room, as it were, but the other big elephant in the room with respect to direct air capture has been concerns about just and equitable deployment. Hopefully, Chris, maybe you can put, yeah, there you go, a couple of links in the chat. We had a great episode with Selena Scott Buechler from Data for Progress and Simone Stewart from WRI on a paper they wrote, which we will put in the chat about just and equitable deployment of the DAC hubs. Also, Selena's organization, Data for Progress, ran some really great polling in the state of Wyoming about attitudes toward carbon removal, and a significant majority, like plus 40% in the state of Wyoming, was favorably disposed towards the deployment of carbon removal. So there's sort of general positivity in the state about it. You talked about your community engagement process, which I think from the outside seems like it was very thoughtful and purposeful. There have been a few criticisms levied towards it. I wonder if you can maybe talk about, you kind of high level outlined the things that you did. Are there things that you've learned that you might do differently next time? Number one. And then number two, what, if you could summarize, have been the primary community objections to the project, and how do you think about addressing those?
Yeah. I think at this time we're still pretty early on in the process. So I would say that, I wouldn't say that there's things we wouldn't do. I think it's what we're doing right now so far is working. I think we're doing a fair bit more than what's normally done, I think, or what has been done in similar projects, I think in DAC for sure. I think in the context of, the objections and where they're coming from, there's been two. I think, one is, I think there's a lot of people who still really have not quite accepted that, the job space in Wyoming is changing and that the transition is happening. And I think a lot of people are, still not ready to admit the fact that, that a lot of the industries around, whether it's coal or oil and gas, are in transition. So I think there's just a general sort of a pushback against, environmental renewable based projects. I think that's kind of, I think for sure a reality there. The other thing kind of surprised us, in particular in Sweetwater County, there's a very strong aversion to the actual location or locating of large solar projects within the county. And I think they had some particular bad experiences. And we've heard stories about, very poorly done projects that had some pretty significant impacts on wildlife route or corridors, et cetera. And so that's the one I think that, we're having to react to and think quite creatively about, how we're going to integrate the renewables projects if they're not actually co-located on the site, which they likely won't be.
Got it. Yeah, I saw that, and I read a couple of things about it. It's like the pronghorn antelope migration patterns, and that is not specific to you, but that's a problem for solar in that area. And part of the problem is that there's a federal rule that says power generation has to be completely fenced in, right? So they're not able to. So it's kind of like a structural issue that people are aware of that they are looking to address. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's some, I don't know if it's truth or rumor, but that because of that, there was some unintended consequences of routing the particular migrating pronghorn onto freeways. So I think that was, whether that's true or not, I think that is the belief.
Yeah. And I think what they're looking to do is maybe create paths through the farms, so like not fence the entire thing in, but fence sections, and so they can actually, the animals can actually traverse the farms. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. Okay, last question, and then we're going to get to the mini audience questions that are rolling in. This is a little bit of a doozy, and it's not a gotcha. I just want to hear what you have to, what your thoughts are. Your previous company, Carbon Engineering, has very much taken the path of partnering with the fossil carbon sector for its deployment, like directly, explicitly, and completely, I would say. So far, you have not done this. What are your thoughts on this? Like both collaboration in general and a specific form of collaboration, which is enhanced oil recovery. Is this something the company will consider in the future, or, like other prominent CDR companies like Climeworks, Heirloom, and others, would you categorically rule out the possibility of partnering with the fossil carbon sector? And I would also just add, there's a big difference between partnering at the equity level and partnering at the labor level, because obviously that workforce is going to be essential to our energy transition.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, we won't engage in any projects related to enhanced oil recovery. That is a line in the sand that we won't cross. Right now, the approach that I've taken, again, it's that in terms of the investment and and having energy companies on my cap table, we're not doing that either. Like, I think again, I really think that that's not beneficial. And again, I'll talk about this in a second. It's not a moral decision. I think it's just a practical one. I think on the back end of the business, when we think about projects and deployment, I think that's where I think we all have to be realistic about the disposal industry and what we're doing in terms of geological storage is coming out of the energy and oil and gas space, and that's where the skills lie. So I think that there's I would never, I guess I won't say never when it comes to the need for us to do some degree of partnering on for example, working, because most of the energy companies now are developing projects around disposal and Class 6 wells that will aggregate CO2 from point source emitters, from DAC, et cetera. And so I think it's likely going to be difficult to avoid partnering, at least on the disposal side for a DAC company, and unless you really want to limit your choices pretty significantly. I think the last I'd say though is that what's interesting, and again, there is really this the two faces of DAC, right? I mean, whether you're really partnered with the with the energy companies, and obviously the implied moral issues with that, or the moral hazard of allowing them to continue to exploit the fossil resources, versus the focus on carbon removal specifically, which is we're on that side. So we're very focused on carbon removal and or use cases for carbon that are separate from enhanced oil recovery. But the reality in the U.S. is that the bipartisan infrastructure law and 45Q in its current form wouldn't exist if we didn't have these two faces of DAC. And so, as much as we choose not to take that particular path with the energy companies, I think, again, we need to be realistic that bipartisan support and the fact that we believe that support is going to remain stable over decades is going to be because of these two ways to think about DAC and two ways to deploy it. So as much as I may personally not agree with it or like it, I think it's kind of essential to the success of the industry, at least to get it going. So
certainly politically, but yep, absolutely. Yeah. That's a great answer. And I really appreciate your transparency. I'm going to put a link in the chat to a podcast from our friends at Climate Energy Center at University of Pennsylvania with Peter Saris talking about enhanced oil recovery, which I personally found very educational. And I think, even if you don't like it, it's really important, I think, to understand it's a nuanced issue. So I'm going to put that in if anyone wants to. Thank you. Megha, do you want to hop on and ask some audience questions?
Hey, yeah, so we've got quite a few. I think we had quite a few people ask about the sorbents you use. So everything from what is the sorbent? How is it affected by moisture? What's the form factor like? How do you clean it from the dust? So could you just maybe talk through a little bit about the sorbent itself? People have questions about that, clearly.
Sure. So I'll talk about what I'll call it our Gen 1 go-to-market sorbents. So again, to be very specific, we're starting out with commercially available amine-based sorbent, so PEI, that's deposited onto substrate. Now that sorbent in the sort of form that is purchased is got issues of both solubility and high temperature stability and oxygen. So in the structuring, what we're doing, and we're doing this actually with a partner who's a very large but not yet named materials company. That's a great partner of ours. They're basically structuring it in such a way that allows it to have a very have very low pressure drop, addresses the issues of solubility, so we can actually approach the heating with direct condensing steam, which is how we're approaching our systems approach. And I think then at the systems level, it's really up to us, so that it's the system that's managing the high temperature stability issues with oxygen. When we look at what we're testing in our labs, there are next generations of sorbents that are moving in more towards polymer-based sorbents, a lot more of the amine functional groups being actually in the backbones of the polymers themselves. So that helps a lot with solubility. Right. And then there's an evolution that we'll see over time. And I'll pause there, because I think that what we'll see 2 years from now still may be in the same structure, but it very likely will be a different base sorbent.
Got it. Okay. All right, we got quite a few questions as well about just the energy requirements. So, is it just electrical energy? Is it also heat? And then how does that kind of compare to the sort of overall removal capacity of the process?
Yeah, so right now the big consumer of energy is on the heat side, and that's on the desorption part of our process. And in the first generation of product, it's nominally about 3 to 4 to 1 is the ratio in terms of heat to electricity. So it's actually dominated by heat.
Okay.
So obviously there's different ways to think about that in terms of where that heat is coming from, or whether or not we're generating the heat just from electricity or not. And it's all a base load of electrical requirements. But that's probably, I think that hopefully answers that question.
Got it. Okay. And is it are you able to use solar sort of intermittently and adjust the timings when the process is running, and kind of optimize around that, or what's kind of the biggest driver and how you organize?
Yeah. So a couple things. So yeah, that's tough because again, when you're thinking about a fairly capex intense machine and process in general, turning it on and off is really problematic from just a cost point of view. But certainly, when we think about renewables, the inclusion of storage is pretty essential to be able to make the project work. I think that so I think and again, obviously there's other regions that that have a different mix of renewables that's helpful. But I think if we're thinking solar specifically, you need to have a storage component there to make it work.
Right. Okay. On the land use thing, I know you talked a little bit about this, but is there a way that you could stack some of these modules upwards to reduce land use requirements? And is that something you'd consider?
Yeah, and I think if you look even at the renderings, the expectation right now, the 3 high is actually there's a reason for that. That sort of nominal 30-foot total height is kind of an important number. So right now, yeah, the intent is to have the unit stacked to that level, and then that's kind of the maximum that I think is desirable when we're talking again from just a visuals point of view.
Okay, got it. And then are there, you were talking about material innovation a little bit, but are there any innovations on the electronics or like other aspects of it that might help the DAC process?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we're working on is really more around the thermal recovery between steps. And so when you think about again, this parasitic mass that's being heated and cooled in every reactor during every cycle, the ability to capture that heat during a cooling phase and shuttle it to the heating phase of an adjacent reactor is actually an area of central focus. So we have some degree of recovery integrated into our very first units. That gets better over time, and I think that's probably again an area where it has a big impact on overall the energy usage of the system. In addition to all the the things we'll take advantage of at the materials level.
Okay, got it. Great. We've got a few questions about the commercialization side. So can you just talk about kind of how you see the offset market developing, as well as any other kind of utilization options you're looking at?
Sure. I think on the voluntary side, we've spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 months trying to I would say do our best to understand what that demand curve looks like, but by that I mean we know that there are a small number of purchasers that are stepping out and paying a pretty significant premium for engineered carbon removals today. It's like somewhere in the $600 to $700 per ton range. We kind of know the other end of this curve. If we could get to a sales price of $100 a ton, that would certainly open up gigatons of demand. What we think though is that as a lot of the ESG commitments start to become come online and become real, sort of 28, 29, 30, the requirements for carbon removals as part of ESG commitments is gonna actually bloom pretty quickly. We're pretty sure that to be at the 1 million tons or greater demand, we probably need to be in the $200 to $250 price to the end customer, and that kind of aligns roughly with a lot of, I would say, at least the more profitable corporations' internal price on carbon. So there's a logic to that, and we're getting, I think, we're getting feedback from some of our early buyers that have eventually, sort of megatons of demand. That's probably around the right number, and that's sort of that 2030 timeframe. So I would say right now that's for us that work on understanding what the pricing needs to be, and also not getting too far ahead of ourselves, because there is, again, until we hit 2030, there is going to be some limitations on just how big the market can be.
Yeah, it's interesting you said. I mean, I think one person asked, and I think we hear this talked about a lot, like everyone kind of has $100 per ton as a number in mind. Do you think that's like a feasible number to hit? And what kind of, scale, capture capacity, time frame do you think is needed if so?
Yeah. No, I think it's absolutely attainable. And I think that when we look at the impact on the materials side to be able to drive much higher capacities per machine and much lower energies, we have a TEA that getting out to 2035 and 2040 certainly will get there. And then the other thing, once you get to a certain point, that's still cost, not price. And I think you still need to have a business. So if you really want to get to $100 price, I think then first of all, I think you're probably talking about a compliance market that has a lot of certainty in it. And you can start thinking about projects that are very low risk. And so cost of capital gets lower. Then you start to need to be operating sort of, where dollars start to become really critical. And that's going to come into some policy based, I think, actions and cost of money and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think it's absolutely attainable.
Okay. Is there like a particular scale you think we need to reach to get there, or is it more about just the time it takes to get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the industry itself will need to have scaled to, to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of tons. I think till you actually are going to get to a point where there is a business being able to, I would say, deliver credits at $100 a ton, but it's before you get to gigatons for sure.
Okay. I'm going to ask one last question before I give us back to Toby.
Okay.
Quite a few people asked, about the community engagement side of things. So could you just talk through, the benefits you see to the community, jobs, things like that, as well as any potential risks that you are seeing, and what is the actual process like of engaging with that community and seeing how it's been received?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously jobs is key, especially in regions that are, in transition, whether it's, from the coal and the coal energy generation or the oil and gas that's sort of at end of life. So on the job side, I think, we've done a few things there. We've been very engaged with the Wyoming Economic Business Council from the very beginning, and we've also been engaged with the local community colleges in that region in the Southwest to be talking about the establishment of training programs, et cetera, to start to build out the labor force for the jobs that will be created on the operations side. The other one that we are talking about but not committing to at this point here, because there's lots of moving parts, is really where we will manufacture the units as well too. And actually at the end of the day, the manufacturing jobs are probably, like, in terms of numbers, probably the most significant, even more than the deployment numbers. So I think that those are I would say where those the biggest advantages are, and where we're, I think, getting the most traction and interest from the communities. Maybe again, just the last part of your question, if you could just repeat it.
Yeah, just what the process has been like of engaging with the community, how is it being received, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think it's been, actually, honestly, it's been really good. And we've had, I think, obviously at state level, we've had strong support and cover, and from the governor as well too, who I think has quite publicly stated that he believes carbon removal is going to be a significant part of the transition away from their current industries. So I think that in general, I think it's been a very positive experience, and I think that the few kind of areas of question and pushback we're getting at the community level, I think, have all been pretty manageable, and I think not necessarily representative of the larger feedback we're getting.
Okay, well, I think that was our last one. So thanks so much for joining us, Adrian, and Toby. Whenever you're ready, I think have a couple.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That really was great, Adrian. Thank you so much. And again, we really appreciate the detail you went into on your process and the very thoughtful answers to the questions from us and from the audience. So thank you. And we know you're very busy, so thank you for your time and really appreciate you being with us.
Okay, thanks very much. It was my pleasure.
All right, take it easy. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and then we're right at the top of the hour. Sorry. Our next week we have Stacy Kalk from Shopify, and it's actually a good segue from what Adrian was talking about the demand for long duration CDR and how are we going to support this industry. Shopify recently issued a buying guide for long duration CDR, and Stacy's going to present that and talk a little bit about her work procuring CDR and what we need to do to get more buyers like Stripe and Shopify out in the market. Don't know what's happening there, but anyway, that is it. We thank you so much for being with us. hopefully we'll put a link, there we go, link in the chat to where you can register for Stacy. And then we have a couple more posted, and we will be adding additional sessions for February and March shortly. So everyone be well, and we will see you next week. And thank you again to Adrian for being with us.